In the summer of 1943, a German pilot climbed into a captured American fighter. He had 45 minutes to uncover its secrets, and what he found terrified his commanders. This flight wasn't just a test. It was a glimpse of the truth the Reich refused to see. July 1943, Central Germany. Oberleutnant Karl Dieter Vogel walked toward Hangar 4 of the Falkenberg test field with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Beneath the fractured skylights, surrounded by the metallic scent of fuel and dust, rested a shape he had never seen before. Sleek, predatory, foreign. Its long, tapering nose and sweeping gull-like wings made it look less like an aircraft and more like some raptor poised to strike. The data plate on the fuselage read, U.S. Navy XF3A Falcon, serial NX312. The machine had arrived barely 2 weeks earlier, shipped from Trondheim, Norway, after an emergency landing by a captured American naval pilot. For the Luftwaffe, it was a treasure beyond price. The first intact Falcon ever recovered in Europe. Vogel had tested over 50 types of aircraft in his career, including British Spitfires, American Thunderbolts, and even a captured B-25 bomber. But this one felt different. The Falcon carried a reputation whispered through intelligence briefings from the Pacific. An aircraft so fast and durable that Japanese pilots had given it a nickname roughly translated as the Silver Howl. Now, the High Command wanted answers. Could this strange naval fighter challenge the vaunted FW-191B or BF-110F? Could it reveal a secret that might help Germany regain the sky it was losing day by day? 3 weeks earlier, far to the north, Lieutenant James Hartford of the U.S. Navy had been flying reconnaissance along the Norwegian coastline. The weather was sharp and clear when the Falcon's massive Continental R3000 twin Sting engine began to stutter. Fuel pressure dropped to 0. Hartford radioed his carrier group, the USS Resolute. But static swallowed his message. He scanned the rocky coast for a landing site, rejecting the idea of ditching in the frigid Barents Sea. A narrow valley near Trondheim offered a patch of level ground. He lowered the gear, cut the power, and brought the fighter down hard. The impact threw him forward but spared the airframe. Hartford had just enough time to destroy his radio and draw his service pistol before German patrols appeared. He surrendered minutes later, bruised but alive. The Falcon, however, survived almost untouched. Bent landing gear, ruptured fuel lines, but structurally perfect. To the occupying command, it was a miracle. They wired Berlin at once. Orders returned under Reinhardt's seal. Recover the aircraft. Transport immediately to the Reich for evaluation. Do not attempt to fly it. Repair parts were unavailable, and the design was alien. So they stripped the wings, hoisted the fuselage onto a coastal freighter, and carried it down the North Sea to Hamburg, then by rail to Falkenberg. The journey took 18 days. By the time the Falcon reached Vogel's hangar, sea salt had crusted over its rivets, and the blue paint had faded to dull gray. Yet even corroded, the machine radiated menace. Vogel circled it slowly, notebook in hand. The inverted gull wing puzzled him. The design allowed a short, strong landing gear, yet ample clearance for the huge three-bladed propeller. The cockpit sat unusually high, almost at eye level with him as he walked past the nose. The canopy glass, though scratched by salt, gleamed under the overhead lamps. 6 gun ports lined each wing. 50 caliber Browning machine guns. 400 rounds per gun. It was an aircraft built not for elegance, but for dominance. When Vogel climbed the maintenance ladder and looked into the cockpit, he noticed how logical the American engineers had been. The instruments were clear, the throttle quadrants sturdy and precise. Even the seat harness mechanism impressed him, a simple, clever lever that locked the pilot tight under high G. No wonder the Allied reports praised its combat stability. For 2 days he studied the Falcon on the ground, sketching, measuring, memorizing. The engineers replaced corroded lines, cleaned filters, and adjusted the propeller pitch. On the morning of August 7, 1943, he was ready. The dawn air smelled of oil and ozone. Vogel stepped into his flight suit, zipped the collar, and walked toward the waiting aircraft. The ground crew had rolled it onto the tarmac, its broad wings catching the pale sunrise. He paused, realizing he was about to fly something entirely foreign, something his superiors secretly feared might outperform every German machine in existence. He climbed in, strapped down, and began the checklist. When he pressed the starter, the twin Sting engine coughed once, then erupted into a deep, throaty roar. The entire airframe trembled. Vogel grinned despite himself. 2,200 horsepower at full throttle, nearly double that of the FW191B he knew so well. Taxiing was awkward. The long nose hid everything ahead. He had to weave left and right to see the taxiway, just as captured Allied pilots had described. At the runway threshold, he eased the throttle forward. The response was immediate, brutal. The Falcon leaped ahead like a released spring, tail lifting almost instantly. At 85 knots, he drew back on the stick. The aircraft rose smoothly, effortlessly. He watched the altimeter spin past 1,000 meters within seconds. The climb rate astonished him. By 3,000 meters, the vibration settled. He trimmed the controls and began gentle turns. The ailerons felt heavy at low speed, just as the Japanese reports had claimed about the Corsair cousin of this design. But once the Falcon built speed, the controls came alive, steady, predictable, solid. He tested acceleration. Throttle forward, nose level. The airspeed climbed, 300, 340, 380, then 410 knots before he eased back. The FW191B barely touched 400 knots in level flight. Even this battered prototype outpaced it. Vogel began to understand the Falcon's doctrine. Power first, turn second. It was not meant to circle an enemy but to strike, climb, and vanish. He recorded everything on his kneeboard. Times, altitudes, engine readings. The sunlight glittered off the canopy. The air above Germany was unnaturally calm. For 30 minutes he ran through maneuvers, dives, climbs, slow rolls. Each confirmed the same truth. This machine conserved energy like nothing he had ever flown. Even after steep climbs, the Falcon retained speed and control. When his stopwatch neared the 40-minute mark, he turned back toward Falkenberg. Below, the forest spread out in endless green. He throttled back, listening as the great engine dropped from a thunder to a purr. He felt a strange respect, even affection, for the foreign creation beneath him. Touchdown came smoothly. The landing gear absorbed the weight with a thump, and the aircraft rolled to a stop. The crew rushed forward. Vogel climbed down, face streaked with sweat and oil. He removed his helmet and stared at the machine. He knew, even before writing a single line, that his report would not be welcomed. What he had seen in those 50 minutes was more than a test flight. It was a glimpse of the future, one his superiors were not ready to face. He turned toward the control tower, notebook in hand, ready to tell the truth. The next morning, the rain had washed the tarmac clean, leaving the Falcon glistening under a pale, metallic sky. Oberleutnant Karl Dieter Vogel arrived at the hangar before sunrise, carrying his leather-bound notes under one arm. The night before, he had barely slept. Numbers ran through his mind. Climb rates, stall speeds, acceleration curves. Every figure contradicted the Luftwaffe's accepted hierarchy of power. He knew what the data meant, and it troubled him. Inside the hangar, engineers in oil-stained coveralls clustered around the American fighter, whispering in awe. One of them, Feldwebel Kramer, straightened and saluted. "Herr Oberleutnant, we checked the compression ratio again. It's absurd. The engine delivers steady output at 1.2 atmospheres above standard. No German radial can do that." Vogel nodded slowly. He could already sense that this machine represented a different philosophy of war. The XF3A Falcon was not a refinement of old ideas. It was a leap forward. Where German design sought precision and symmetry, the Falcon embodied brute force and simplicity. It was designed to be forgiving. A pilot's weapon, not an engineer's dream. He climbed back into the cockpit for a static systems test. The layout struck him again. Every dial in logical order, every control labeled with unambiguous clarity. Even the oxygen system, which German aircraft often made cumbersome, operated with the press of a single valve. He thought of young Luftwaffe cadets struggling with overloaded panels in the Bf-110F. This, by comparison, felt like a modern automobile. At 0900 hours, General Otto Reinhardt arrived from Berlin. flanked by 2 staff officers. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a spotless gray uniform, Reinhardt carried the air of a man whose faith in German technology bordered on religion. He approached the Falcon, circled it once, and frowned. "So this is the American wonder," he said curtly. "It looks overweight." Vogel stood stiffly. "Sir, its mass distribution is unusual, but the power compensation is extraordinary. It maintains stability even under violent climbs." Reinhardt tapped the aluminum skin with a gloved finger. Thin, wasteful. Then his eyes narrowed. "You've flown it?" "Yes, sir. Yesterday morning." "And?" Vogel hesitated only a moment. "It exceeds our FW191B in almost every performance metric: speed, climb, and endurance. Its structural integrity is astonishing. I could execute a 6G pullout without frame distortion." The general's jaw tightened. "Impossible. Allied reports exaggerate. Perhaps this one has been modified." "With respect, General, the opposite seems likely. This specimen shows corrosion, slight warping from salt exposure. A factory-fresh unit would perform even better." Reinhardt's eyes flicked toward his aides, silent but dangerous. "Document your findings, but avoid speculation. I'll decide what goes into the official record." Vogel saluted. Inside, a cold certainty formed. The truth would be unwelcome here. For the next 3 days, he performed controlled tests, takeoffs, gear retraction cycles, stall recoveries, and gunnery alignments. He learned to handle the Falcon's quirks: the heavy ailerons at low speed, the narrow landing stance, the violent left-wing stall below 150 knots. Yet none of those flaws masked its brilliance. The Falcon was a predator in vertical flight. At 6,000 meters, Vogel simulated combat maneuvers. He banked hard, dove steeply, and watched the speed gauge surge past 440 knots. Then he pulled the nose up into a vertical climb. The altimeter spun. 6,500, 7,200, 8,000 meters. The airframe groaned but held. He leveled at 8,900 meters, breathing through his mask, his body pinned by gravity's hand. The climb had taken just over 2 minutes. He remembered the FW191B's record, nearly 4 minutes for the same altitude gain. The realization chilled him. The Falcon could strike, escape, and reappear before a German pilot even reset his gun sight. In the unforgiving geometry of aerial warfare, that gap, those 2 minutes, meant death. On the ground, Vogel recorded every variable: fuel mixture settings, flap responses, thermal readings on the exhaust manifolds. His report already filled 20 handwritten pages. Detailed sketches of wing root reinforcements, notes on control harmony, even the peculiar American rubber seals that prevented oil leakage. That evening, he returned to his quarters and poured himself a glass of schnapps. Rain whispered against the window. He stared at the lamp's glow and thought of the broader picture. Germany's skies were no longer safe. By mid-1943, Allied bombers struck with increasing precision. Luftwaffe squadrons, once the terror of Europe, now flew defense rather than offense. And here he sat, holding proof that the enemy's technology had outpaced their own. He wondered what would happen when Reinhardt read his full report. Would the general suppress it? Would he, Vogel, be labeled defeatist? He closed his notebook, muttering to the empty room. The truth flies faster than bullets. The next morning brought another challenge. Reinhardt summoned him to the command hut. On the desk lay a sealed envelope stamped with the Black Eagle insignia. "Oberleutnant Vogel," Reinhardt said evenly. "Berlin requests a full operational evaluation. You are to push the Falcon to its combat limits. Altitude, speed, and endurance, everything. But," he added, leaning forward, "you will do so within safety margins. I want no destroyed prototypes. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "You have 1 hour of flight authorization. Make it count." Vogel saluted, turned, and left. He knew this was not a routine order. It was a test, not only of the aircraft, but of his loyalty. As he walked toward the hangar, the Falcon shimmered in the morning light, wings outstretched like a metallic hawk. He felt a strange kinship with it, both of them caught between truth and command, between science and pride. He climbed aboard, the cockpit canopy sliding shut with a solid metallic click. He adjusted his straps, checked the altimeter, and pushed the starter switch. The engine thundered to life, the sound echoing across the field. At 800 hours, he began to roll. The Falcon lunged forward, gathering speed. The world blurred into motion. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, Vogel thought, not for the first time, that perhaps this American creation was not merely an aircraft, but a warning carved in steel and fire. The Falcon roared down the runway at Falkenberg Field, slicing through the early mist like a blade. Oberleutnant Karl Dieter Vogel gripped the stick tightly, feeling the aircraft surge with an animal urgency. The moment the wheels left the ground, the vibrations of the earth gave way to the living pulse of sky and engine. He leveled briefly at 2,000 meters, checked his instruments, then pushed the throttle to maximum. The Continental R3000 Twin Sting responded instantly, a guttural growl deepening into a thunderous symphony. The airspeed climbed, 320 knots, 360, 400. At 420 knots, he pulled into a shallow climb. The Falcon obeyed effortlessly, its nose rising like a predator sniffing the wind. For the next 10 minutes, Vogel followed the test plan, handling checks, roll rates, and climb profiles. But as he gained altitude, the routine dissolved into revelation. The Falcon felt alive, balanced between ferocity and grace. At 7,000 meters, he initiated a power climb. The needle trembled at 450 knots. He pulled hard on the stick, blood draining from his head as the G-force pressed him into the seat. The altimeter spun madly, 8,000, 8,500, 9,000 meters. He leveled off with a gasp, lungs burning behind his oxygen mask. Even under punishing acceleration, the aircraft held firm. No flutter, no stall buffet, just raw stability. "This isn't an airplane," he muttered through his mask. "It's an engine with wings." He decided to test the Falcon's vertical engagement pattern, the strategy Allied pilots allegedly used in the Pacific. The method was simple but lethal. Dive from above, strike fast, climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. Vogel wanted to know whether it worked in the unforgiving mathematics of real air combat. He climbed to 8,500 meters, throttled back, and rolled inverted. The earth flipped beneath him, a swirling tapestry of clouds and fields. He pushed the nose down, letting gravity take hold. The airspeed indicator screamed past 470 knots, 500, 530. The aircraft trembled but held true, the wings flexing slightly under pressure. At 4,000 meters, he pulled up, straining against the crush of 6 Gs. Darkness closed in at the edges of his vision. His body felt molten and heavy, but the Falcon didn't flinch. It sliced upward again, climbing like a bolt of silver lightning. At 7,000 meters, Vogel leveled out, breathing hard. He checked his stopwatch. 2 minutes, 30 seconds to regain 3,000 meters of altitude. He wrote the number on his kneeboard. The FW-191B in the same maneuver had taken over 4 minutes. The Falcon was 35% faster in recovery. In combat, that advantage was decisive. He imagined a duel, a German pilot diving after the Falcon, engines screaming, guns blazing. But as soon as the American machine climbed again, the German would lag behind, bleeding energy, unable to follow. The Falcon could simply roll over, dive again, and repeat. A perpetual predator. Vogel switched to gunnery trials. He nosed into a 30-degree dive, centered his sight on a radio mast far below, and pressed the trigger. The 650 caliber guns erupted with synchronized fury. The recoil shook the airframe, but the sight picture barely shifted. The bullets tore the earth in a perfect line, like a knife cut across cloth. Vogel smiled grimly. German aircraft like The FW-191B carried heavier 20mm cannons, but their recoil ruined precision. The Falcon's lighter guns were far steadier. More bullets on target meant more kills. He jotted another note. Stable firing platform. Recoil absorption excellent. Accuracy high. Suitable for high-speed attacks. Then he turned his thoughts to defense. What if a Falcon were attacked from above? The nightmare every pilot feared. He throttled back, dropped to 3,500 meters, and rolled into a defensive brake. The stick felt heavy. The aircraft resisted quick rolls. He gritted his teeth, forcing it through a hard left turn. The Falcon groaned. The controls bit back. Against an agile FW-191B, it would lose in a tight circle fight. But then he did what instinct and the aircraft's design demanded. He leveled out, slammed the throttle forward, and let the twin stings scream. Speed rose like a tide. 320 knots, 360, 400. In seconds, the imagined attacker was gone. The Falcon was already climbing again, free, untouchable. He laughed into the oxygen mask, exhilarated. Now he understood the American philosophy. Don't fight where you can't win. Fight where you can't lose. At 9,000 meters, Vogel tested the stall characteristics. He eased back on the stick, bleeding speed. The nose lifted, the horizon vanished, and then, snap! The left wing dropped violently. The Falcon flipped inverted before he could counter. He fought the stick, engine roaring, heart pounding. For 3 long seconds, gravity owned him. Then the controls bit again, and the aircraft leveled. He exhaled shakily. The stall was brutal. Sudden, without warning. A pilot who panicked would die before recovery. He wrote in block letters, "Never slow down in combat." He continued testing for another 10 minutes. Dives, turns, acceleration tests, each confirming what his gut already knew. The Falcon's weaknesses were narrow. Its strengths were absolute. It was built for altitude, speed, and command of energy, not for turning duels. If used correctly, it could dictate every engagement. By the time he turned back toward the airfield, 50 minutes had passed. The engine still purred without complaint. He descended through layers of pale cloud, the sun glinting off the wing roots. Below, the hangars of Falkenberg looked tiny, toy-like. As he entered the landing pattern, weaving to see past the nose, a strange calm washed over him. He knew what his report would say, and he knew what Reinhardt would do with it. Touchdown was smooth. The ground crew rushed out, waving, thrilled that he had survived the extreme trials. Vogel climbed down slowly, removing his helmet. His face was flushed, his uniform damp with sweat, his mind racing. He handed his logbook to Kramer, who asked, "Well, sir?" Vogel wiped his forehead. "Write this down," he said quietly. "If the Americans ever bring this fighter to Europe in numbers, we are finished." Kramer stared. "Do you mean—" "Yes," Vogel interrupted. "Completely finished." He walked toward the operations hut, his boots echoing on the wet concrete. He could already imagine Reinhardt's expression. Disbelief turning to anger, then to quiet denial. Truth, he thought, was heavier than any aircraft. That evening, he began typing his 16-page report, each paragraph an indictment not only of German engineering, but of the arrogance that blinded it. He wrote until midnight, describing every measurement, every maneuver, every tactical implication. When he finally set down his pen, he whispered to himself, "They won't believe a word of it, but they'll know it's true." Rain hammered the corrugated roof of the operations hut as Karl Dieter Vogel slid the final page of his typewritten report into the binder. 16 pages, double-spaced, stamped with the insignia of Luftwaffe Test Division, Falkenberg Field. He read the title again. Comparative Evaluation of Captured XF3A Falcon Fighter Aircraft, August 1943. It was not just data. It was confession. Inside those pages lay a quiet acknowledgement that the Reich's dream of air superiority had already begun to crumble. Vogel placed the report on the desk of the communications officer, sealed with his signature and the field command stamp. By regulation, copies were to be transmitted to the General Stab in Berlin, with an immediate duplicate to General Otto Reinhardt. He hesitated for a moment, then added a personal note on the cover sheet. Recommend urgent tactical review. The XF3A Falcon's performance surpasses current German standards by significant margins. Existing defensive doctrine insufficient. He knew it was too blunt, but honesty was a reflex he had yet to unlearn. 2 days later, an unmarked car rolled onto the field. Out stepped Reinhardt, accompanied by a stern-faced staff officer in black gloves. They entered the control tower without ceremony. When Vogel was summoned, he found Reinhardt seated behind the desk, flipping through his report. The pages were creased and smudged, clearly read more than once. Oberleutnant Vogel, the general began, his tone icy. I've reviewed your findings. You are thorough, I'll grant you that. But some of your conclusions are problematic. Vogel stood at attention. Problematic, sir? You claim this American machine is superior to our latest production fighters. That's quite a statement. Only in certain regimes, General. Speed, energy retention, and altitude performance. But you also recommend that our pilots avoid engagement if possible. Reinhardt's voice sharpened on the last words. He tossed the report onto the desk, the pages fanning open to the tactical summary. Do you realize how this reads? Defeatism. The Falcon is a naval design. Heavy, unwieldy, irrelevant to our European campaign. Yet you portray it as invincible. That is not analysis. That is surrender. Vogel met his gaze evenly. With respect, sir, I record what I observe. The Falcon's energy profile cannot be dismissed. If such aircraft ever appear over Europe, our current tactics will fail. The staff officer leaned forward. You're suggesting the Luftwaffe cannot adapt? That our doctrine is obsolete? Vogel hesitated only a heartbeat. I'm suggesting that truth does not care for doctrine. The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Reinhardt's expression hardened. Your technical competence is not in question, Oberleutnant. Your judgment, however, is. He rose, towering behind the desk. This report will be classified. Distribution restricted. You are not to discuss it with anyone. Do you understand? Yes, sir. You will continue testing other Allied aircraft as assigned. Consider this matter closed. Vogel saluted sharply, turned, and left. But as he stepped into the corridor, the word closed echoed like a verdict. In the following weeks, Vogel resumed his duties. He flew captured Spitfires, P-47s, and even a stripped-down B-24 bomber, each flight a reminder of the enemy's relentless evolution. Every logbook told the same story. German innovation was falling behind. Yet Reinhardt's office issued no further inquiries about the Falcon. Rumors spread quietly among the mechanics and test pilots. Someone had overheard a courier mention restricted findings. Others whispered that the Falcon report had been sent to Berlin and promptly locked in an archive labeled technisch nicht relevante Unterlagen, technically irrelevant documents. Still, photocopies began to appear. One evening, Vogel found a carbon duplicate of his own work pinned anonymously to the bulletin board in Hangar 2. Someone had scrawled across the title page in pencil, "Read this before the next sortie." By the end of the week, half the test staff had read it. Within a month, copies had reached operational fighter units along the Western Front. It was unofficial knowledge now, the kind that traveled faster than orders. In September, a message from Berlin arrived, stamped with the Reich's eagle and signed simply OR. It read, "Effective immediately, the XF3A Falcon test project is terminated. The aircraft will be crated and transferred to the Technische Akademie for static analysis. Personnel reassigned. All related reports are to be archived under Section 12B. Vogel folded the message neatly and placed it in his journal. He did not argue. He had learned that the Reich feared truth more than defeat. The next morning, under a gray sky, the Falcon was rolled into a crate. Its wings were detached, its propeller bound in canvas, its cockpit sealed with wax paper and rope. The sight felt like a funeral. The machine that had touched the edge of the possible was now to be buried under bureaucracy. Vogel stood beside it as the crate was lifted onto a flatbed truck. A young mechanic, no older than 20, watched in silence. "Why hide it, sir?" he asked. "It could teach us something." Vogel didn't answer at first. Then he said quietly, "Because lessons cost pride, and pride is all they have left." Weeks turned to months. Vogel continued his assignments, but something inside him had shifted. He flew by the numbers, wrote his evaluations, smiled when spoken to. But every time he looked up at the northern sky, he remembered the Falcon's climb, that impossible surge into blue, the sense of freedom that no uniform could command. One cold October evening, a courier from Berlin delivered a thin envelope. Inside was a single page, a transfer order. He was to report to Erprobungsstelle Süd, near Munich, for further evaluations of Allied aircraft. No mention of the Falcon. He folded the order and slipped it into his logbook. Before leaving, he returned once more to Hangar 4, now empty except for the oil stains on the floor where the American fighter had once stood. He placed his gloved hand on the cold concrete. "You flew better than they deserved," he murmured. Then he turned out the lights and left Falkenberg behind. In the archives of the Luftwaffe, the Falcon report would remain sealed for the rest of the war. Berlin never admitted its existence. But among the pilots the legend grew. They whispered of an American fighter that could dive faster, climb higher, and fight only on its own terms, and of a German test pilot who had warned them, only to be silenced. For Vogel, the war was far from over, but something deeper had already ended. His faith in the command that refused to see. April 1945. The air over southern Germany trembled with the sound of artillery and the distant thunder of advancing armies. At the Erprobungsstelle Süd, once a proud Luftwaffe testing center, smoke drifted from hangars and files burned in metal drums. Oberleutnant Karl Dieter Vogel stood at the edge of the airfield, watching flames consume years of data. Blueprints, reports, performance charts, everything that once defined the Reich's pursuit of technological supremacy. Among the piles awaiting destruction lay a crate marked XF3A Falcon. Technical Evaluation Material, Section 12B, the same crate he had watched leave Falkenberg 2 years earlier. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned to a sergeant nearby. "Leave that one," Vogel said quietly. "I'll handle it." The sergeant nodded and moved on. Vogel pried open the lid. Inside were the remnants of the captured American fighter. Sections of wing spar, fragments of instrument panels, a cracked gun sight lens. The once living machine had been dissected and left to rot. Yet even in ruin, it seemed to hum with latent power. A relic of an idea his country had refused to understand. He reached into the crate and retrieved the old test report. His report, now yellowed and fragile. The first line still read in crisp type. "The XF3A Falcon represents a fundamental evolution in air combat design philosophy." He folded the pages carefully and slipped them into his flight jacket. If nothing else survived this war, the truth would. 2 weeks later, Vogel fled west with a convoy of refugees. He no longer wore his uniform, only the insignia of an engineer sewn into his coat. When the American 7th Army crossed into Bavaria, he surrendered without resistance. To his surprise, the interrogating officers already knew his name. One of them, Captain William Hartmann, a pilot himself, asked the question before anything else. "You're the man who flew the Falcon, aren't you?" Vogel blinked. "You know about that?" Hartmann smiled faintly. "We've read fragments of your report. Found a copy in Hamburg last month. Seems Berlin didn't burn everything." The two men talked for hours. Hartmann asked about the Falcon's handling, its performance, its strengths and flaws. Vogel answered openly, sketching diagrams on scrap paper, explaining the vertical fighting doctrine that German command had dismissed as impractical. When he finished, Hartmann shook his head slowly. "You know," he said, "our Navy pilots said the same thing you did, that the Falcon isn't meant to outturn the enemy. It's meant to outthink him." Vogel smiled wearily. "Then they understood it better than we did." Months later, the war was over. Germany lay in ruins, and its once mighty Luftwaffe was little more than memory. But Vogel's knowledge proved invaluable. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the United States Air Force, invited him to work under supervision. Testing captured German aircraft at a facility in France, then later in America. He accepted, not out of loyalty, but out of curiosity. For the first time he found himself flying in open skies without ideology pressing against his back. He tested Messerschmitt jets, Allied prototypes, and even early experimental designs that would one day lead to the jet age. But in interviews and technical briefings, one story always resurfaced: the Falcon. When asked which aircraft had impressed him most, he would always answer without hesitation: the American XF3A Falcon. It was the future disguised as the present. In 1956, Vogel published his memoir under the title Wings of Reckoning. The book detailed his experiences as a test pilot, from the days of early Luftwaffe training to his capture and cooperation with Allied engineers. But it was the chapter about the Falcon that captured attention. Readers were struck not only by his admiration for the enemy's machine, but by his scathing criticism of the German command structure that refused to confront reality. He wrote, "In 1943, I flew the truth for 50 minutes. It climbed faster than any lie could follow. We chose to ignore it, and the sky punished us for our pride." The memoir became a quiet classic among aviation historians. Decades later, the Falcon itself would be remembered by another name, the Corsair, a legend of the Pacific. Yet within the annals of Luftwaffe archives, only one report existed that had ever called it by its proper due, the one Vogel had written, hidden, and saved from the fire. In the 1970s, Vogel visited the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Inside a vast hangar gleamed a restored F-4U Corsair, painted deep blue, wings folded like a sleeping bird. He stood before it silently, reading the small plaque that described its combat record. Thousands of missions, hundreds of victories, and a reputation for invincibility. An American docent approached. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Vogel nodded. "Yes. I met one of her sisters once." The docent smiled politely, not understanding. Vogel stepped closer to the aircraft, tracing his fingers along the riveted skin. He thought of the young mechanic in 1943, the empty hangar at Falkenberg, the report that nearly disappeared, and he whispered, barely audible, "You never needed to prove yourself, only we did." Karl Dieter Vogel lived quietly in southern France after retirement, working as a consultant for private aviation firms and writing occasional essays on flight dynamics. He died in 1991, age 77, survived by his wife and 2 children. At his funeral, a small display of his flight records was arranged beside the coffin. Among them was the faded copy of his Falcon report, now brittle with age, its title still legible: Comparative Evaluation of Captured XF3A Falcon Fighter Aircraft, August 1943. Historians would later call Vogel's story a microcosm of the Luftwaffe's downfall. A man who saw the truth, wrote it down, and watched it buried beneath arrogance, only for it to resurface decades later as vindication. His words became a cautionary reminder to generations of engineers and soldiers alike. The refusal to listen does not silence reality. It only delays the reckoning. The Falcon, meanwhile, became an enduring symbol, not just of power or innovation, but of the idea that the sky itself answers only to those who respect truth over pride. And in the end, as the last echoes of that era faded into history, one line from Vogel's memoir remained quoted in countless lectures and aviation books. "I flew the Falcon once, for 50 minutes in August 1943. It was enough to understand everything." History isn't written only by victors. It's written by those brave enough to tell the truth. Karl Dieter Vogel's 50 Minutes in the Sky became a lifetime lesson about courage, humility, and the price of denial. His story reminds us that honesty can outfly even the fastest machine. If you found meaning in this journey through forgotten skies, don't let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe to help more people discover untold stories of courage, technology, and the human spirit. Your support keeps these wings of history alive.